we've pretty much covered everything. I'm going to just kind of summarize a little bit and then focus on the first half of this twin ideal, the motto of the order, was actually much less controversial than the second half. The second half, this idea of working for the welfare of the world, this was something that some of Swamiji's brother disciples did not like at all, and for some it took years before they were willing to accept it. Some picked up on it right away from the very beginning. Some felt it was very much contrary to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. It was interesting to see the dynamics. We know there was tremendous love among all of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, but they were all independent thinkers, and they all had their own very strong beliefs, and they all had their conviction about what they thought was really the message of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. So, just for those who weren't here at the very beginning, let me just read this. The first time we hear this phrase, Atmano Mokshartam Jagat Hitaya Cha, was when Swamiji was giving a preliminary talk to 4 of the first batch of sannyasis that became monks of the order after the direct disciples. So this was in April of 1897. Remember, the sannyasi is born in the world, Atmano Mokshatam Jagat Hitaya Cha, for the salvation of his own soul and for the good and happiness of the many, to sacrifice his life for others, to alleviate the misery of millions, rending the air with their cries, to wipe away the tears from the eyes of the widow, to console the heart of the bereaved mother, to provide the ignorant and depressed masses with the ways and means for the struggle for existence, and enable them to stand on their own feet, to preach broadcast the teachings of the scriptures to one and all, without distinction for their material and spiritual welfare, to rouse the sleeping lion of Vedanta in the hearts of all beings by the diffusion of the light of knowledge. For this the sannyasi is born in the world. So there are several things here that became a little bit problematic. One is this idea of working for the welfare of others. Can we really do it? Then this idea to preach, broadcast the teachings. Are we qualified to do all of this preaching? Then, without any distinction, we forget about this adhikara veda. Is everybody really qualified for this? So all of these things were combining all of these things. We find that not everyone was very happy, and shortly after this, when they had the meeting in Balaram Bose's house, when they founded the Ramakrishna Mutt and mission, some of Swamiji's brother disciples raised some objections, and it was a very emotional meeting there. I think Swami Yogananda was a little bit too strong and said a few things, and Swamiji got very upset and accused everybody of not really understanding Sri Ramakrishna, because they half accused him of not understanding Sri Ramakrishna. So it was a very emotional period at that time, and only because of their tremendous love for Swamiji and their faith in Swamiji could they accept these things without fully endorsing them, at least at the time. Now, this idea of working for the welfare of others, they'd heard Sri Ramakrishna say too many times that first realize God, then worry about the world, and they all knew only the very traditional role of the monk, which was to withdraw from society, and they all had this burning desire for God realization. So they felt that this was their main duty, that traditional monks in India, after the Buddhist period at least, did not do too much in terms of social welfare or anything like that. So this became point of contention for many of them. And some really, Swami Yogananda, Swami Niranjananda, they both died very young. And not all of the monks of the order did really social service type of work. Some of them picked it up very early. Swami Atmajnananda and others, we see that they caught that fire of Swamiji and that spirit of Swamiji. So, what was the exact objection to this idea that is part of the goal of life for the sannyasi, and because this was something he enunciated at the meeting for the Ramakrishna Matin mission, which meant that all the householder disciples were there also. That Balaram Bose was there, Ramchandra was there, M was there, all of the initial people, because the Ramakrishna mission was responsible for this social service wing of the order. At that time was mostly the householder devotees. They were the ones who were supposed to run all of that. So, what was the controversy? One thing was that they thought it was contrary to Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. This was one thing, and then that it wasn't for Orthodox monks to do this. And Thakur warned them that those who get too involved in this kind of stuff will get mixed up with the world. There can be some attitude of superiority, some ego comes into it, all of the things that they heard, but most of the time these were addressed either to the Brahmo Samaj people, for whom the social welfare work was everything, or to those who were toward the end of their life. If we read the advice to Ishan, one of the most beautiful chapters in the Gospel, advice to Ishan, he was elderly at that time, and Thakur felt this was the time when he should really give up all of these other things, because he did some things. He would do arbitration. He would set himself up as kind of an expert for things, and Thakur loved him very much and saw that towards the end of his life that he had this tremendous potential to have some higher type of realization. Vidyasagar, he had spent his whole life doing wonderful work. Thakur never said that it was bad. He praised him for it, but he said if he knew that there was gold hidden within, then he would lessen some of his activities and everything and try to have that higher type of realization. Yeah, so he said the work that Vidyasagar does is good. You know about this Vidyasagar? He was very well known at the time in Bengal, in Calcutta. He was considered to be the most philanthropic individual. He was a great scholar. He he was a great Sanskrit scholar and started the Sanskrit department at Calcutta at the university, and wrote different grammars and things, but he was best known for helping anyone who came to him. And that meant poor widows and students. Anyone would come and say, we don't have money to buy books, this and that. He would help everyone. And he was very progressive in terms of reform. He was also he wasn't exactly a Brahmo Samaji, but he shared a lot of ideas. So he was very much in favor of the remarriage of widows and against a child marriage and all of those things. So he spent his whole life doing good deeds and good work, and he was very highly thought of in Calcutta at that time. But Thakur met him, and he saw that the whole mind was engaged in good work, but going outward, and he was older than Sri Ramakrishna at that time. And so he said that if he knew the treasure he carried within himself, that his work would be reduced, that he had that gold within, that he could have that type of divine realization. There were plenty of people to encourage this type of social reform movement. Thakur was alone to tell people God can be realized. This is the goal of life. So his emphasis had to be strong. It had to be to tell people that's good what you're doing, but that's not the ultimate goal of life. So he had to be very strong with that type of thing. That doesn't mean that he was against these types of... And for Swamiji, we'll see that this working for the welfare of others and worshipping God through service of others are two different things. And if we do it with that attitude, then it's also helping us to have this type of higher realization. So these were some of the objections that no matter how much we help this world, the world will remain the same, like the curly tail of the dog. We saw all of these things, that we can straighten it out and it'll go right back the way it was before. And then this other idea that monks are supposed to have gone through all of this. That this karma yoga, doing good deeds, is meant to purify the soul, purify the heart, so that then we're free to dive deep into meditation and everything. And let the householders do these good deeds and everything. The monks should spend all of their time in spiritual practice. So these were some of the reasons that why especially the direct disciples, and among the householders, M had very strong objections to the social service work that was done in the beginning, that Swamiji instituted. Now, we shouldn't think that Swamiji had any problem with the objections that were based on Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, because he agreed with them. He understood that for the most people, if we try to help other people, there'll be this feeling of superiority. This is why he based everything on that teaching of Sri Ramakrishna, that we're not fit to help anybody. That who are we to show compassion on anybody, that we do it out of love, we do it out of fellow feeling. Swamiji went even further. We feel that the self within me is the self within you. So it's really serving ourselves. That we do it with this idea that it's a privilege to serve somebody else, that it's a type of worship to do that. So Swamiji was also not in favor of what we can say a type of social work attitude. This idea that all these poor people, that we'll save them and we'll tell them what to do, and a very patronizing type of attitude. He understood that everything that Sri Ramakrishna said, all of this was true. And Swamiji understood that we'll never change the world. The world will go on the way it is. And that we're helping ourselves when we do this type of work. This is that basic idea of karma yoga. But again, for Swamiji, he was also a patriot. We have to understand that. And he knew that the real reason why we want to help others is not just so that they can be materially better off. But he said to try to force religion down the throats of people who are starving for a loaf of bread is cruel. He said first bread, then religion. So first he raised them a little bit. So this gift of food, annadanam, had to be followed by the vidyadanam. Then we give education, and then jnanadanam. Then we give the gift of spiritual wisdom. So he had a very broad view that part of serving humankind meant material welfare, but we saw also preaching, giving these ideas which were denied to the average person, that this was also part of his idea of working for the welfare of others. It wasn't simply a social reform type of thing. Now we see in the Gita, and we see in the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, a very common idea that we have two different levels, two different tiers in spiritual practice. And one is a preliminary, where we try to purify the heart, where we do regular spiritual practice. This is called different terms. He says Vaidhi Bhakti, we can say one point of view. And then when we reach that stage of Anuraga, we reach that stage of heart overflowing with love and devotion, then we abandon the first stage. We have this also in this Gita verse, where those who are trying to attain to the state of yoga ruksha, that these people will practice the karma yoga, they'll do that. Then, once they reach that stage, then shama karanamucha, then they practice withdrawing and quietude and everything. Sri Ramakrishna also had this idea, we see this, that he gave the illustration of the daughter-in-law in the family when she becomes pregnant, that each month the mother-in-law reduces her workload until the final month comes. She has nothing to do. Then after the child is born, she spends all of her time nursing the child and looking after it. So he said that in the beginning we will do this type of work, the karma yoga and everything, all of our practices, but as we get closer and closer, higher and higher to some type of spiritual realization, then our duties become fewer and fewer. And then ultimately everything falls away, and all we care about is God realization. And then after that, if we want to work for the welfare of the world, we can. If we don't, we don't have to. So this is one type of two-tier theory. Now Gita and Swamiji, he also, they both talk about this other idea. One is that karma yoga doesn't have to be preliminary. We practice karma yoga and then jnana yoga. This is Shankaracharya's very traditional Vedanta. That karma yoga is preliminary, it's for purification of the heart, and then after that we're free to practice jnana yoga or Raja Yoga meditation. But Gita also says that some realize God through karma yoga alone, and Janaka and others, this can be done. Some through bhakti alone, so this is another way of looking at it. Now there's really no contradiction, because those who engage in this type of work for the welfare of others, even those people will reach a stage where they'll have done everything that they need to do and want to do, and are ready to give up. That'll fall off on its own. So that itself will lead to this higher stage. The thinking that Swamiji had, which was brilliant and very, very important to understand, the traditional idea was that those who became sannyasins in the old days, it could have been done in their old age also. It wasn't all the way. They did it after leading a full lifetime. They'd entered the final stage of life, or they were very pure from birth, straight from the brahmacharya stage. They went to the sannyasa stage, and they were perfectly qualified to lead a deeply contemplative type of life. Swamiji understood that in this present age, that simply this desire to lead a monastic life, to dedicate oneself to the ideal of the order, did not mean that any of us as monks are qualified to lead a strictly contemplative life. And he was very, very right about that. It's a very brilliant understanding that very few, if you look at not just the monks of our order, but just in general, theoretically it's very nice to say someone is ready to take sannyasa, they're ready to lead a contemplative life. But the practical reality is that we come into this life still with that need to practice this type of karma yoga and to purify the heart and to engage in work. Holy Mother was very, very adamant about that. She used to say, don't be without work for a moment. Then the mind gets restless, it thinks of all sorts of things. So it was very brilliant for the benefit of the young monks of the order also, that they had very constructive work to do. They were taught to do it as worship, and that this would allow them to reach that stage when they could lead a more contemplative type of life. So Swamiji did a great service to the whole monastic tradition that way. If the monks of our order were told from the very beginning, you spend all of your time in study and meditation, most couldn't do it, and others would end up leading a lazy type of life. There are very few people who can really do that. We hope that through the Swamiji's ideal that we ultimately reach that point where we can go deeper and deeper into meditation and do them side by side. This was Swamiji wanted to see the monks of the order to be so well-rounded that they can do their meditation in the morning, and then they'll get up from that, and then they'll cut the vegetables, and then they'll take them to the market, and then they'll go to the cow shed and milk the cows, and they'll come back and do accounts in the office, and then go back to the shrine and go deep into meditation. He wanted to see there's an equal development of the full personality, which meant the different types of yoga, the 4 yogas that we have. So this was a combination of for the benefit of the monks and the devotees, and also that, as I say, Swamiji was a great patriot. He really wanted to raise the country, and he felt that a lot of the problem with the country was that these beautiful teachings of Vedanta had been denied the people, and where was the time for them to even imbibe them if they could, because of this great poverty. So he developed this beautiful doctrine of the Daridra Narayana. So God dwells equally in all beings, but a greater manifestation in the poor. And the first duty is to help eliminate poverty through education, let them raise themselves. So not this condescending attitude, we'll tell them how to do it, let them raise themselves. And then they can be ready to do some type of spiritual practice. The whole life isn't worrying about, how to feed the family and all of these things. So then the final charge would probably be that these 2 things are counterproductive. That if we do this type of social service work, that the mind won't be able to sit quietly in meditation. That we have to lead a very contemplative type of life, quiet type of life, not mixing with people too much, in order to really go deep in meditation. And this is true if we don't have the right attitude when performing work. If all of our work is done as an offering, if it's done seeing God in others, all of that, then it's helpful for meditation. If we do it with detachment, it's the attachment that causes the problem, the attachment and the ego. Otherwise, these things are all very helpful in spiritual life. Now, I mentioned some of the brother monks immediately understood this. The best example is Swami Atmajnanananda. And Swamiji wrote some beautiful letters to him. And he had some very special affection for Swami Atmajnananda. He wrote in one letter, it seems that I have some very special excessive, I love you more than others, or I have some very special love for you. He was very fearless. He went to bed on foot, back and forth 2 different times. He started some educational programs for the very poor, outcast children, and was almost killed by the Brahmin community who were dead against it. And then, when there was terrible famine in the Murshidabad area, in West Bengal, he started an orphanage because so many of the parents died leaving the children there. He started an orphanage for them. Hindu children, Muslim children, both without any distinction. And he himself, if there was no food, he himself would go without food to make sure that they had food. So Swamiji was so proud of him, and he thought his work was tremendous. And really it was supported by all of the other monks of the order. Swami Brahmananda, Swami Ramakrishna, they all tried to raise funds and send it to him. Just a few holdouts. As I say, that M was one of the real holdouts. Now, I mentioned earlier that some of the hospital work that was done, the work was done by Swami Kalyananandaji and Swami Nishtanandaji in Rishikesh and Kankal. We also started a hospital in Kashi, this Varanasi Sevashram. And Holy Mother went there. Holy Mother never doubted Swamiji. This is an interesting thing. That she understood very, very clearly that Thakur was working through Swamiji. So we started a hospital there. She went one time and saw all the work that was being done there. And at that time, M was also there. And then M still had some doubts about all of this. The Thakur never talked about doing this type of work or anything. And the Holy Mother was very proud of everything that was done. And she said this was Narendra's work. She said, Narendra is an instrument in the Master's hand. It is the Master who is working through Naren. What Naren has said is true. In the future his words will be fulfilled. And when he came back, that was much later, but when he came back from India, she said to him, the Master is always with you. You have many more things to accomplish for the welfare of the world. So she understood, all of these things. I have some nice quotes here from a beautiful book called Toward the Goal Supreme. This was written by Swami Virajananda, and he was one of the ones that really wasn't too interested in this type of social service work, uplift work, because he wanted to really dive deep in meditation, which he did. But anyhow, he wrote, Swamiji, having received hints from Sri Ramakrishna as to how this great truth, worshipping God and man, could be practically applied in the daily lives of householders and sannyasins without distinction. So this isn't just for the monks. Proclaimed to the world his path of serving all beings by seeing Narayana in them. He insisted that by practice, the Vedanta doctrine of the identity of Jiva and Brahman can be directly perceived and applied to the service of man, with the object of teaching mankind that the ideal of one's own salvation and doing good to the world is not only not self-contradictory, but mutually helpful. He established the Ramakrishna Mutt and mission. Mutually helpful. So this type of service will help us go deep in spiritual life, and if we can achieve anything in spiritual life, that itself will be for the welfare of the world. If we can achieve some true spirituality, that will be the greatest service. Then he also wrote, Swami Virajanandaji, this Nara Narayana worship instituted by Swamiji is not merely unselfish, unattached karma for the good of others in order to gain purification of one's heart, which was a traditional view. Karma yoga is just to purify the heart so we can have some other type of higher realization, but is entirely a new process of sadhana for the realization of the Paramatman or the highest self through the practice of a wonderful harmony of jnana, yoga, bhakti and karma. And because it is so, it directly leads to the attainment of mukti. So both of them helping each other. For in this path, one has to conceive of God through jnana yoga as one's own self, meditate on God through raja yoga as the self within, be attached to him through bhakti yoga with a whole soul devotion, and through karma yoga serve him with disinterested, desireless actions. So I was saying that when Holy Mother went to Varanasi and she saw that work, and she was very much pleased. So she even gave a donation. I think in 10 rupee note or something. If you go to the office there, of course they didn't spend it. They framed it. You'll see it hanging on the wall there. So everyone knew that M didn't really approve of all of this. So they kind of teased him. The other brother monks were there. And when they saw how Holy Mother was praising all of this, they went and they got M. And then she said in his presence, Ramakrishna is ever present in the place, and Mother Lakshmi always casts her benign glance upon it. So later one of the monks said to Holy Mother, to M, Mother has just told us that the activities of the home of service were service to Sri Ramakrishna himself, and that he was tangibly present here. Now what do you say? M replied with a laugh, how can I deny it anymore? This is Swami Premananda. This is also very interesting. He and Swamiji clashed a number of times on different things, because he was the one who was the manager of Bellarmine. He had to see that the worship took place at the right time. He had to look after the brahmacharis. He had to train them up. And as a Swamiji, he would get lost. Time didn't mean anything to him. He'd be giving classes and everything. So that we find very often they would clash on a few things, but they loved each other. They had a very, very close, sweet type of relationship. Anyhow, this Swami Premananda was a little more traditional. And he also never got too involved in this type of social service work. Then he outlived Swamiji by many years. Towards the end of his life, this must have been about 19, something like that, he had a very, very serious illness, and they thought he would die. He knew that he wouldn't die. You know how he knew it?
Oh.
His mother was a great devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, and Thakur went to the mother and said, I want you to give me something. He said, what do you want me to give? I want you to give me your son. That means because he was so pure, Thakur wanted him to be his attendant and also to renounce the world. And then she said, one doesn't give a son for nothing. You have to grant me a boon. So he said, all right, what do you want? And she said, may I not live long enough to see the death of any of my children. That was the boon. And he said, okay. So the Swami Premananda, they said, the doctors are fearing for your life. He said, no. There's nothing to fear. My mother is still living. He had that faith, and he recovered. But during that period, he read all of the writings of Swamiji. Everything was translated into Bengali at that time also. I don't think he knew English very well, but he read that. And he said it created a tremendous revolution in his mind, that he really understood exactly what Swamiji meant, why he did what he did and everything. And after that, he used to tell people, I'm Swamiji's disciple. He was Thakur's disciple. And he wasn't denying that, but he just meant he had so much devotion to Swamiji. So after that, wherever he went to speak, because he spoke in many places, he spoke in East Bengal, many places. Anyhow, he would speak about Swamiji's idea about serving God and man. That was so sometimes they would ask him, Swamiji, why do you only speak about that? Or want to talk to us about devotion, about bhakti? He said an interesting thing, this in Malda. Somebody asked him that, and he said, I don't see anybody qualified to hear it. We think bhakti is such a simple thing. Yeah, we have to have tremendous purity of heart to really practice this bhakti yoga. So eventually all of them came around, and now we see what tremendous work is done by the order, and how it's really revolutionized the whole concept of service in India. Almost every monastic tradition now, and as I said yesterday, Sai Baba, Ammachi, all of these gurus of India that have large followings and organizations, they all have their free. One of the Sai Baba hospitals, one of the best in India now. They'll treat people for free and everything. So this idea of service, as conducted by the spiritual leaders and monastic traditions in India, is something very well accepted at this point. So working for the welfare of the world, it really means serving others as manifestations of God, which we all have to do, which we all want to try to do it. It means serving others with humility, not thinking that we're superior to them in any way, understanding our limitations, devoid of pride and ego, feeling that it's a privilege. Swamiji said, let the giver bow down, let the receiver stand up and receive, let the giver bow down and with gratitude that we're able to serve that way. So serving with feeling that is a privilege, the spirit of self-sacrifice, and understanding that this is the highest type of worship. Swamiji had such high regard for this idea of selflessness. One time he said, unselfishness is God. So to live in this world selflessly, serving others without caring for ourselves, is a tremendously high ideal. He wrote a beautiful letter, I think, to one of the Dewan, where he said, this life is short and the vanities of the world are transitory, but they alone live who live for others, the rest are more dead than alive. So for Swamiji, this was really the highest ideal, to sacrifice oneself for the welfare of others, but this will lead also to one's own sense of freedom, because freedom from ego, freedom from pride, all of that. So this was this twin ideal, which we see are really perfectly connected. They're not two separate things. During the time of work, and we can put them into practice equally. During the time of work, we serve others with all our heart and soul, with all our love, with all our devotion, without caring for our own liberation. At that time, we can forget about this mukti idea. Serving God is a type of worship, serving others is a type of worship. That's a privilege, not out of compassion. This compassion is too low an ideal, and it makes us feel separate from others. But during the time of meditation, we can strive for God realization. We forget the world exists. At that time, we just try to dive deep and go within. So we can practice these two side by side, and then we see that they both work together. We understand serving others as worship of God is a direct means towards liberation. So that works that way. And if we can achieve some type of spiritual realization, this is also a tremendous service to all of mankind. So what looks to be a little bit controversial, what on the surface looks to contradict some of the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and even some of the things that Swamiji says, if we understand it in the right light, we see that there's no contradiction. That the striving for liberation really means that we want to realize the truth. We want to realize our true nature. And working for the uplift of others really means that we want to practice selflessness, we want to see God dwelling in others, and we want to do whatever we can to serve others as a worship of God. So this is that beautiful ideal meant for the monks of the order, meant for devotees equally. So I'll stop here, and we have time for a few questions if you want, and then we'll have supper.